Hi, in this video I'm going to talk at a very high level and very briefly about the importance of input validation when you're programming, and specifically how you need to get input through your GUI and make sure that you're doing it safely. Okay, so input validation is really important because you have no idea who is going to be giving data to your program. You don't know if they're going to be having a bad day. You don't know if they're going to just be not that smart and not really understand how to input data. Maybe it's going to be a kid. Maybe it's going to be somebody who is cognitively impaired. They could actually type anything into your little boxes if you're not careful. And once you let the data in, it's your problem. So the idea with input validation is to not let in bad data. So you need to design the GUI in order to do this. So what happens if you don't validate input? What are the problems that can happen? First of all, your program may end up doing dumb stuff. Like, you put in a negative price and instead of charging people money for products, you actually end up giving them money when they buy your products. That's not a good idea. Your program could crash just because you've got some data that isn't in the right format, and then you try to do something with it and you're not thinking about whether it's in the right format. It could actually just sort of do something like cause some kind of exception or what have you. And then the program crashes and your user is really annoyed. And of course, the biggest problem is that if you don't do input validation, you are exposing your software. You're making it vulnerable to people with bad intentions. Hackers use input as a way to put in crazy long strings of text that do really weird things that allow them to get access to your databases and your data and cause really, really significant trouble. So you need to make sure that you are checking everything that a user inputs into your program and making sure that it's valid. So there's sort of two main steps to input validation. The first step is a sort of a syntactical step. So think of yourself as being a compiler. The Java compiler, when you type int x and then you give it a string, says, wait a second, that's not an integer, and it doesn't let you move forward. So you, when you're designing the GUI, have to think that way. If you want an integer from the user, then you need to check and make sure that they've given you a number and not a bunch of letters. So check to make sure that it's a number if you're expecting a number. If you're actually supposed to be getting a string of letters, make sure that it is a string of letters and it doesn't contain any other things. And when I say check, there's all sorts of methods built into Java that let you do that. So for example, there's a isAlphanumeric. There's a method that allows you to try to convert a string to a number, and it will tell you whether or not it's able to do that. If you're supposed to be getting a username, make sure that it has no spaces in it. So in that case, you might have to iterate through each character and check and make sure that none of them are spaces. All of these things by themselves are straightforward and pretty easy to do. It's just that there could be a lot of this stuff that you have to do. You could end up writing a fair amount of code to do all of this, and that's just your job as the programmer. The second step to input validation, once you've made sure that the format of the data is correct, that you've got a number where you expected a number, that you've got a string where you expected a string, etc., is to make sure that the values that you got make sense logically for your program. And this is something that is completely your responsibility as the programmer, because nobody else other than the person who's writing the program knows what the right values can or should be. So for example, maybe you're asking for a date. If you want them to enter a number that's a month, well, clearly that number has to be between 1 and 12. If they give you 17 or 0 or -3, those are not valid months. They might be numbers. They fit the syntactical step of validation, but logically they don't make sense. If it's a price, it probably needs to be a positive price. You don't usually charge negative prices. If the value that you're collecting is supposed to be the outside temperature, and we're not talking about temperatures on Mars, we're talking about temperatures in the United States, probably you want to do a sanity check and make sure that the number entered is not above 120, because it's unlikely that there's going to be a temperature higher than that. And if you got a number that was like 1200, Or maybe you got a number that was 980. Well, maybe what they were trying to do was type 98 Fahrenheit and they accidentally added a 0. So that allows you to check and tell the user, no, no, sorry, that doesn't make any sense. Try again. That's not a valid temperature. And then things like string comparisons. Well, if you're asking them to enter the name of a country and somebody enters Texas, well, that's not a valid country name, no matter what Texans think. So you might need to take the name of the country that they typed in and check against a list of countries that you have. Or better yet, provide them with a list of countries and let them select one rather than making them type in the string. Because if they type in the string, maybe they wanted to type in Sierra Leone and they didn't know how to spell it. So by providing them with options to choose from, you actually limit both the syntactic and the logical errors. And finally, there can be dependencies in your input. So, for example, if the user already entered the month as February and then goes to enter the day, well, they can't enter the day of 30 because there is no February 30th. So those are other things that you also need to check for to make sure that your input is valid. So this all kind of sounds really hard, and none of it is particularly hard. There's a lot of things that you can do to make this easier. So probably the most important thing is to use the right kind of widget on your forms to collect the data. Whenever possible, provide the user with a list of options to choose from rather than having them just write in free string text, because they'll make spelling mistakes, they'll have extra spaces that need to be parsed out, and they'll possibly write down options that are not valid. So by providing the right widget to collect the data, you can get way ahead of the game and make your input validation job so much easier. Second, if the data is required, you need to make sure that it's there before you let the user go forward. And you all seen this on lots of different forms where you go to submit and then it says, sorry, you didn't fill in this field or you didn't fill in this field. And so that's also part of input validation. Your job is to make sure that you have the data needed to do the work that your program needs to do. And a common way to do this is to pop up a dialog box that tells the user what field is missing. Finally, once you've got the data, you may need to convert it into the best format for validity checking. So suppose you decide that really you want the user to be able to enter a number, and you want to do it as a text field. So they enter, 113. When you get that out of your text field, it's a string, 113. So you could compare 113, and suppose you're looking for a number between 1 and 12, you could do a string comparison of the string that you got, 113, against 1, against 2, against 3, against all of those as strings, but that doesn't make any sense to do. That's just ridiculous. If it's supposed to be a number, convert it to an integer, and then check, is 113 greater than 1, and is 113 less than 12, and then you'd see that actually you have an error. So make sure that you first convert your data into the best format so that you can do the validity checking that you need to do. And that's about it.